Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, UWI St. Augustine.
I'm Philip Emeagwali. On June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, I began my search for the new knowledge of how off-the-shelf processors could be harnessed and used in tandem to create the world's fastest computer. I discovered that such a supercomputer will not be a computer in and of itself. It will be a new internet in reality. I imagined that new internet as my new global network of processors that were identical and uniformly distributed across the surface of a globe, but distributed just as computers are distributed around the earth. My search for the fastest supercomputer demanded that I begin from the beginning, which is the laws of physics that existed since the Big Bang explosion, or the small singularity that inflated over the past 13.8 billion years and inflated to become the present cosmos. In my 2-decade-long quest, I scourged the history of physics, then of calculus and algebra, and mastered the frontiers of knowledge of those three important subjects. That mastery enabled me to harness the total and maximum supercomputing power of my coupled ensemble of the 2 raised to power 16 slowest processors in the world. Those off-the-shelf processors were designed for a mainstream market rather than for supercomputing, and they were manufactured in large numbers and for a lower price. My most significant contribution to computer science is this. I discovered that 1 million processors can power supercomputers. In an email, a 12-year-old writing the biographies of great inventors and their inventions asked me, "What is Philip Emeagwali known for?" I'm known for discovering that up to 1 billion off-the-shelf processors can power the world's fastest computers. In the 1980s, I was ridiculed for pursuing the then useless technology of the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world. But by 1989, I was in the news for discovering fastest computing with slowest processing. After my discovery, vector supercomputer scientists who had ignored me wanted to become my new best friends. That invention of computing with millions of processors put a black African face in science classrooms and alongside the faces of Galileo, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein. My contribution to computer science was how I chipped away at one of the fundamental assumptions of the myth of white intellectual superiority. Such myths were sincere fictions of the white self, fictions that only white males, the likes of Albert Einstein, were endowed with the intellect that was needed to make substantial contributions to human knowledge and to solve the most challenging problems at the frontiers of knowledge of the fields of mathematics, physics, and computer science. Those sincere fictions legitimized IQ science and white power. Furthermore, those sincere fictions legitimized white privileges, including favoring the immigration and hiring of Western and Northern European scientists over Black sub-Saharan African scientists. Not only that, those sincere fictions legitimized attacking affirmative action policies that would have produced more African American supercomputer scientists who could have contributed to making parallel and quantum supercomputers faster. Over the decades, those sincere fictions became the status quo. I discovered the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world, and did so on the 4th of July, 1989. Before my discovery, it was assumed that Albert Einstein is more intelligent and more knowledgeable than Philip Emeagwali. The reverse now holds across genius rankings posted on the internet. Historically, the Black invention was rarely understood in the racial context it was made. Looking back to June 20, 1974, the day I began programming one of the world's fastest computers that was at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, USA. The toughest part about being a marginalized Black computer scientist was that I was expected to repress my oppressed identity. As a mathematical physicist, I always knew that the laws of logic and physics are experienced the same way by Black and white persons. In 1974, I conceived the first world's fastest computing across a new ensemble of 64,000 processors. I visualized my new technology as encircling a globe, and doing so just as what we later called the internet now encircles the earth. In May 1981, in College Park, Maryland, I embarked on my mathematical quest for how to solve the most compute-intensive problems that needed to be solved on the world's fastest computers. In 1981, the open mathematical question was this: can mathematicians solve an initial boundary value problem, such as simulating the flows of crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that are buried up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers deep and within an oil-producing field that is almost twice the size of Anambra State, of the state of Anambra, Nigeria? And can we hindcast or reforecast those fluid flows across a new internet that's a new spherical island of up to 1 billion off-the-shelf processors? Each processor had its dedicated memory. That difficult problem was at the crossroad where new physics new mathematics and new computer science intersect. In the 1980s, the US government classified that problem as one of the 20 grand challenges in supercomputing. Solving the most intractable problems that arise simultaneously in mathematics or physics or computer science demands a higher mental power than writing a poem or a play or a novel. That demand is akin to the belief that lifting a car demands physical strength. The research computational mathematician who can solve or parallel process the toughest problems that arise in extreme scale computational physics is believed to have a stronger brain muscle or a higher mental power or a higher IQ than those who cannot. Solving the most difficult problems in mathematics and physics are the reasons Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein are in the perennial list of the smartest people that ever lived. For me, the early 1980s was my period of a quote-unquote hand proofs that delineated my paths from the blackboard to the motherboard and across my new internet that I visualized as a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. That was when and why I coded the processor-to-processor email algorithms, which I invented for solving the resulting huge system of equations of computational linear algebra. That was how I constructed my message past 65,536 processor codes. I invented those processor codes for solving the most difficult problems at the frontiers of knowledge, of mathematics, physics, and computer science. What made the news headlines in 1989 was that I executed those 65,536 codes at once and across a global network of 65,536 processors that I visualized as a new internet. In the 1980s, I experimented across an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world and across an internet that's a global network of those processors. Those processors were identical and were equal distances apart. Each processor had its dedicated memory that shared nothing. I executed my experiments that yielded the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world, and did so by using the initial boundary value problems in weather forecasting and in petroleum reservoirs modeling, and using both difficult mathematical problems as my computational test beds. My new speed from my world's slowest processor experiments was the world's fastest computation. I recorded that speed at 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. My supercomputing discovery led to a new understanding of how millions of processors could be harnessed and used to make the fastest computer and make the supercomputer practical in addressing some of the world's most important and complex challenges. Such difficult mathematical problems include more accurate weather forecasts, powering the world with green energy and manufacturing efficient and safer automobiles and personalized medicine that extends lifespans. That new understanding led to the world's fastest computer that's not supercomputing with one processor. We now understand the world's fastest computer as supercomputing across millions of processors. My major contribution to computer science is this. I was the first person to record the fastest computer speed and do so alone. On the 4th of July 1989, I was confident that I've discovered the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world, and that I've solved one of the most compute-intensive problems in computer science. In the 1980s, the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world was an unknown field of computer science. I was the only known expert that could solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and physics. I discovered how to solve the most difficult problems across up to 1 billion coupled processors. That was the reason I became the first person to record the fastest computer speeds and do so across my ensemble of 65,536 coupled processors. At first, my discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors was ridiculed and rejected. Not only that, I was dismissed because non-experts were asked to review the fastest computer speed, which I recorded across my ensemble of 65,536 coupled processors. I was the only person that understood my discovery. Furthermore, I described that discovery in my 1,057-page research report that only I understood. That should not come as a surprise because I was the first and sole full-time programmer of the biggest supercomputer ever built. Such supercomputers now occupy the footprint of a football field, and it costs 40% more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. The billion-dollar price tag ensures that supercomputing will never become a child's play. 3 often asked questions are, what is the Philip Emeagwali computer? How did Philip Emeagwali invent the world's fastest computing? How were the Philip Emeagwali equations reformulated from calculus to algebra? The 9 Philip Emeagwali equations that I invented were abstract and differential, and they were the most advanced expressions in calculus and were difficult to understand. I discretized those partial differential equations by using partial difference schemes that I invented. That was how I reduced them from a system of equations of calculus to a seemingly infinite system of equations of computational linear algebra, which I solved across my ensemble of the slowest 65,536 processors in the world. In the 1970s and 80s, I knew that the world's fastest computer speed was a technological achievement that could be measured in the manner the speed of a marathoner is measured with tapes and watches. But in calculus, the watches are soft and genius is subjective. On the 4th of July 1989, I was challenged to submit my discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world and allow my new knowledge to be retested by the foremost experts in supercomputing. I accepted that challenge and took my discovery to a 15-day supercomputer workshop that took place between September 1 and 15 of 1989 and in the outskirts of Chicago, Illinois. At that supercomputer workshop, my discovery was discussed by programmers who had programmed vector supercomputers and hoping to program parallel supercomputers. After that 15-day supercomputer workshop, a sense of anticipation arose from my discovery that the world's fastest computing can be extracted from the slowest processors in the world. By the end of that supercomputer conference, the consensus was that my discovery deserved to be recognized by the highest award in supercomputing for the year 1989. But a few naysayers openly challenged me to resubmit my discovery to the committee of judges who awarded the most prestigious prize in supercomputing. That award committee was appointed by the two top computer societies in the world, the Computer Society of the IEEE, or the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, and the Association for Computing Machinery. In December 1989, I submitted my scientific discovery of the world's fastest computing to the Computer Society of the IEEE in San Francisco, California. I won that prize in supercomputing that computer scientists rank as the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing. That discovery and the prize generated the news headlines: African supercomputer genius wins top US prize. Winning that top supercomputing prize gave me credibility and a handle. That most prestigious prize separated me from the other 25,000 vector supercomputer scientists. A coveted prize was the quote-unquote scientific evidence that my supercomputer discovery of how to execute the world's fastest calculations and do so across up to 1 billion coupled processors and solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and science. It was an undeniable proof that I made an original contribution to the development of the world's fastest supercomputer that now computes faster with millions of processors. That top supercomputing prize made me stand out in the community of prominent mathematicians and top physicists. My discovery of the first world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world changed the way mathematicians and physicists use the supercomputers to solve compute-intensive problems in their fields. My discovery of supercomputing across the slowest processors was new knowledge that inspired vector supercomputer scientists to change the way they look at the fastest computers. The chances of a supercomputer scientist winning the highest award in supercomputing and winning that prize alone was only 1 in 25,000. With the exception of myself, that most prestigious award or diploma in supercomputing was shared by up to 50 supercomputer scientists. 50 names were inscribed on their award diploma. It was like 50 persons sharing one diploma. In the 1980s, I was the only full-time programmer of the most massively parallel supercomputer ever constructed. That supercomputer is the precursor of the world's fastest computer of today. Being the first person to discover something is better than being the best person in doing that thing. On July 4, 1989, I became the first person to discover that parallel computing is faster than sequential computing. It's faster when both technologies are used to solve the world's most compute-intensive problems, such as modeling climate change. That breakthrough opened the gate to the widespread use of millions of processors to power the world's most powerful supercomputers. In 1989, I stood out because I was the first person to win the highest award in supercomputing and win it alone. I was the first person to win that prize for solving the most compute-intensive problem in supercomputing. This year, the highest award in supercomputing was shared by 28 co-winners. That prize enabled me to stake massively parallel computing as Philip Emeagwali territory and as the place where the fastest computers exist. My scientific discovery of world's fastest computing was validated and replicated across the ensemble of millions of processors that define and outline state-of-the-art supercomputers. The $45 billion a year market value of the world's fastest computers affirms the importance of using up to 1 billion processors to power every supercomputer. It should be noted that the world's fastest computing is the supreme validation of a new supercomputer. A scientific discovery is a personal property that becomes public property if and only if it's disclosed to the public. I transferred the ownership of my discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world and signed it over on 3 disclosure occasions: July 4, September 15, and December 25, 1989. The scientific community responded to those disclosures of my discovery and did so by awarding me the highest award in supercomputing. That supreme validation was time-stamped for the year 1989. I've shared 1,000 videos on YouTube. My videotaped lectures are my compression of 5 decades of scientific research into a series of 1-hour remarks. It's akin to compressing my life story into a parable. I couldn't describe everything that I know within 1,000 hours. I only presented the crux of my contribution to my new internet. That's a new supercomputer intrinsically. It cost more than $1 billion to create the world's fastest computer, but it cost nothing to listen to my lecture on how I discovered how to execute the fastest computer speed and how to do so across up to 1 billion processors, which outline and define the world's fastest computer. For me, June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, was the beginning of my long train of thoughts and experiments across a new spherical island of 65,536 off-the-shelf processors and standard parts. Those processors were identical. I visualized those processors as uniformly distributed across a globe. I defined my ensemble of coupled processors as a never-before visualized internet that encircles a globe, and that's a small copy of the internet that encircles the earth. In 1989, I was in the news because I discovered how to harness my new internet and used the new technology as one seamless, coherent, and gigantic machinery that's the world's fastest computer in reality, but not a computer in and of itself. I didn't invent my new internet in one day back on June 20, 1974. Nor was I instantaneously struck with the 9 Philip Emeagwali equations. I solved my system of partial differential equations beyond the frontier of calculus, and I solved them via their companion partial difference equations of large-scale computational linear algebra. I solved them in my thoughts and solved them during the experiments that I executed across my ensemble of 65,536 processors. Those processors were identical and surrounded a globe as a new internet. The inklings of parallel computing I had in 1974 grew from a mere acorn to a mighty oak tree that was the fastest computation across a new internet. The new internet is a new global network of coupled processors sharing nothing and uniformly distributed around a globe. It made the news because I discovered how to harness those slow processors as a supercomputer. On the 4th of July, 1989, I discovered how to use up to 1 billion processors to solve the most compute-intensive problems in mathematics and physics, such as global climate modeling. In the 1970s and 80s, harnessing 1 million processors and using them to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical problems was supercomputing's equivalence of being the first person to summit Mount Everest. As an aside, the first climbers who made it to the top of Mount Everest did so in 1953. Since then, only 5,000 climbers climbed to the summit of Mount Everest. By comparison, only one person single-handedly recorded the world's fastest computer speed across the slowest processors in the world. In high-performance supercomputing, recording the world's fastest speed is the most coveted milestone. In the 1980s, the fastest speed in computing recorded across the slowest processors was a milestone that 25,000 supercomputer scientists dreamt to achieve. That fastest parallel supercomputer was a milestone in the history of mathematics and computer science. I was the first and only person that benchmarked that milestone successfully. I benchmarked it on the 4th of July, 1989. It made the news headlines that a Nigerian supercomputer genius in the USA had recorded the fastest speed in the history of computing. I recorded that speed across the slowest processors in the world, and I recorded that speed while solving the most compute-intensive problems in the world. To put my supercomputer invention from a literal perspective, writing a novel or a book takes a couple of years, and up to 1 million new books are published each year in the USA alone. And reading and critiquing my supercomputer invention of how the fastest supercomputer can be built with the slowest processors is as easy as spending time on Facebook or WhatsApp. The grand challenge in deeply understanding my contribution to the highest performance supercomputing was to spend $1 billion to reconstruct the massively parallel supercomputer that will be needed to recreate my world's fastest computation. And most importantly, test that world's fastest computation on production petroleum reservoir simulations that are executed across millions of off-the-shelf processors. And finally, recreate that fastest speed as mandated by the scientific method that characterized natural science since the 17th century. My scientific discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors changed the way mathematicians solve the 20 most difficult mathematical problems in science, engineering, and medicine, and changed it from solving one problem at a time to solving up to 1 billion problems at once. Changing the way we count is a fundamental change of tectonic proportions and a shift that has occurred only once in the 200,000 years of the existence of humanity. In the 1980s, I used more supercomputers than any person ever did. I alone was the only full-time programmer of 16 massively parallel supercomputers that were each powered by up to the 65,536 slowest processors in the world. The massively parallel supercomputers of the 1980s were abandoned because they were then mocked, ridiculed, and dismissed as a tremendous waste of everybody's time. Back then, the supercomputer textbooks wrote that it will forever remain impossible to solve the most compute-intensive problems and solve them at the fastest speeds and solve them across an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world. In 1989, I was in the news because I proved everybody wrong and did so by solving the most compute-intensive problems and solving them with the slowest processors and solving them at the fastest possible speeds. That was how the fastest computing across the slowest processors became my signature discovery and became one reason I'm the subject of biographical essays on famous inventors and their inventions. My contributions to developing the world's fastest computers were these. I discovered that a binary billion processors that were locked together can be programmed to emulate one seamless coherent machinery. That's a supercomputer in reality. A binary billion is 2 raised to power 32, or 4,294,967,296. I discovered that the number of processors needed is proportional to the compute intensiveness of the mathematical problem. More often than not, the most compute-intensive problems arise as variations in physics calculations, particularly in geophysical and astrophysical fluid dynamics. The physics roots, as well as the mathematical and computational structures of the global climate model, differ slightly from that of the petroleum reservoir simulation. I presented reservoir simulation in my 1989 discovery, for which I won the highest award in supercomputing. Climate and reservoir modeling are the prototypical problems of large-scale geophysical and astrophysical fluid dynamics. The supercomputer enables medical and scientific discoveries to occur at the fastest pace. It's used to pull the future closer. The world's fastest computers were used to discover how COVID-19 spreads. My discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world made the news headlines in 1989 and made it impractical to continue selling outmoded supercomputers that were powered by only one processor. Within 5 years after my discovery, the manufacturers of vector supercomputers couldn't sell that technology. For those reasons, they ran out of funds, laid off their employees, and filed for bankruptcy protection from creditors, and filed it under Chapter 11 of the US Federal Bankruptcy Code. The world's fastest computer is not a child's play. It occupies the footprint of a football field. It costs 40% more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. It's the world's most complex invention. The world's fastest computer is powered by up to 1 billion processors. Each processor had its operating system. Each processor shared nothing with its nearest neighboring processors. That first supercomputer that's used to solve the toughest mathematical problems and solve them fastest across the slowest processors is described as the most complex creation of the human mind. Nigeria has 159 oil fields and 1,481 oil wells. The first oil field in West Africa was discovered in 1956 in Oloibiri, Nigeria. The oldest oil well in Nigeria was sunk in 1958. Oloibiri was a fishing and farming community that's a distance of 45 miles or 72.4 kilometers east of Port Harcourt. The Oloibiri oil field covered an area of 5.31 square miles. Only half of the crude oil discovered in Oloibiri was recorded, or rather was recoverable. 20 years after that first oil well in Oloibiri was sunk, that first oil field in Nigeria was abandoned. The warning from Oloibiri is that the 159 producing oil fields of Nigeria will dry out in 20 or 30 or 40 years. In 50 years, Nigeria will not be an oil-producing country, and Nigeria will be dismissed from OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. I'm often asked, what is the Philip Emeagwali computer? Why is Philip Emeagwali known for fastest computers? And what is the influence of calculus on the development of the computer? In June 1970, I claimed, or rather reclaimed, my mathematical language. And I did so when I bought the 568-page blue hardbound book that was titled An Introduction to the Infinitesimal Calculus. That calculus book was written by G.W. George William Count and published by Oxford University Press. In developing the world's fastest computer, calculus was the pink elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about. The secret to my 1989 world's fastest computing was that I discovered how to divide and solve the most compute-intensive problems in calculus. I divided it into an equivalent set of less compute-intensive problems that I solved across my ensemble of 65,536 processors. My processors computed in tandem and were in dialogue with each other. At first, and in the 1970s, I was confused because I did not know where each processor was located at. The one vertex of a 16-dimensional cube to one processor correspondence gave me an intuitive understanding of where each processor was located. That new knowledge enabled me to record the fastest speed in computer history. In the history of the computer, we expect the next generation of computers to be 10 times faster. I discovered a billion-fold increase in the speed of the world's fastest computer that's powered by a billion processors. To invent a supercomputer is to take a big risk and leapfrog into the future. An often asked question was this: what is Philip Emeagwali known for? I'm known as the first person that figured out how to solve the most compute-intensive problems that are important to society. Such intractable problems are governed by a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and three-dimensional partial differential equations that are beyond the frontier of calculus. Such partial differential equations must be discretized or reduced to an almost equivalent system of equations that's the largest in computational linear algebra. I was in the news because I was the first person that parallel processed across an ensemble of 64 binary thousand off-the-shelf processors that were identical and coupled to each other. In the 1970s and 80s, I thought of myself as a research computational mathematician, searching for the world's most powerful supercomputer, In those 2 decades, my goal was to execute the fastest floating point arithmetic operations that must be used to solve the world's most compute-intensive problems in science, engineering, and medicine. That was how and why I searched for and discovered the fastest arithmetical computations, and searched for and discovered new algebraic knowledge, and searched for and discovered new partial differential equations of calculus. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I create new equations the way Bob Marley writes new songs. I sing in the mathematical dialect of the universe. My quest for new mathematical knowledge was a personal search for the lost language of God. In my quest for the never-before-seen supercomputer that's the fastest ever, I encoded the second law of motion of physics into the partial differential equations of calculus. I then discretized those partial differential equations into corresponding and approximating partial difference equations of large-scale algebra. Finally, I developed my 65,536 computer codes, which I used in a one code to one problem corresponding manner, and used to solve each of my 65,536 subsets of those systems of equations of large-scale algebra. I translated the world's biggest mathematical problems, and did so from prose to the supercomputer circles which I executed to solve those compute-intensive equations that would otherwise be impossible to solve. In 1989, I was in the news because I was the first person to figure out how to compute across 2 raised to power 16 or 64 binary thousand, quote unquote, little computers called processors that surrounded a globe. I visualized my globe as embedded within the 16th dimensional hyperspace. My ensemble of processors encircled that 16th dimensional globe, and did so in the way the internet encircles the earth. My supreme quest for ultra-fast computations from the world's fastest computer was like launching 65,536 or 2 raised to power 16 digital arrows into the unknown 16-dimensional hyperspace. Each arrow carried an email message to a 16-bit long address and across 16 times 2 raised to power 16 pathways that had a one-to-one correspondence with as many bidirectional edges of the cube in the 16th dimensional hyperspace. Visualizing the world's fastest computer that I discovered in the 1980s and imagining the technology as a new internet within the 16th dimension was published as science fiction back on February 1, 1922. But on the 4th of July, 1989, I figured out how to turn that science fiction to non-fiction. Fastest computing across lowest processors is my contribution to the supercomputer that occupies the space of a soccer field, and it costs more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. In my supercomputing, I computed in parallel rather than in sequence, or solved up to 1 billion problems at once rather than solve one problem at a time. I was asked, how do you want to be remembered? The contribution of Philip Emeagwali to the development of extremely fast computers is this. I was in the news in 1989 for discovering that the world's fastest computers must be powered by up to 1 billion processors. Prior to my discovery that occurred on the 4th of July 1989, the fastest computing across the slowest processors existed only in science fiction. I want to be remembered for the first world's fastest computer that was powered by the slowest processors in the world. I'm studied in schools because I'm the first person to know some things in mathematics, physics, and computer science that were not known to anybody before me. My quest for the world's fastest computer was like flirting with the infinite. Looking back, my failures were the price that I paid for my successes. Short-term failures are necessary, but not sufficient conditions for long-term successes. My contribution to computer science is this. I was the first eyewitness to the fundamental shift that yielded our new understanding of the world's fastest computer. The new supercomputer is an ensemble of up to 1 billion processors that each operated its operating system. I recorded the world's fastest computer speed. More importantly, I did so while solving the most important and most compute-intensive problems known to humanity and solving them across a new internet. My internet was a new global network of the slowest processors in the world. I visualized my supercomputer as outlined and defined by 2 raised to power 16 off-the-shelf processors that each had its dedicated memory. Furthermore, I visualized those processors as equal distances apart. Likewise, I visualized those processors as etched onto the hypersurface of a globe. I visualized that globe as embedded within a 16-dimensional hyperspace. That global network of processors is called the Philip Emeagwali Internet. Not only that, I fulfilled my part of the tacit requirement that every scientist from Einstein to Emeagwali who contributed to science must share his or her new knowledge on YouTube. In an email, a 14-year-old writing an essay on famous scientists and their discoveries asked me to describe how I want to be remembered. As an aside, 95% of my supercomputer research notebooks that began on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, are unpublished. But they should be published and remembered. I want my unpublished writings, handwritten notes, and unpublished lectures and conversations to be digitized, duplicated, and archived in the USA. They should be made public in Nigeria on my 200th anniversary or on August 23 of the year 2154. I want to be remembered for discovering how to map the complex problems of physics across the millions of processors that power the world's most powerful computers. I want to be remembered for discovering how to solve mathematical problems that will be otherwise unsolvable both on the earth and in the heavens. I'm often asked to explain why I left the southeastern region of Nigeria for Oregon in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. I decided to leave Nigeria 6 months after its 30-month-long war was over. I left before significant petrodollars flowed into Nigeria. I was a Biafran refugee who dropped out of school from ages 12 to 15 and dropped out of school again from ages 17 to 19. I dropped out to live in refugee camps of Biafra of the Nigerian Civil War. 1 in 15 Biafrans died during that 30-month-long war. More Igbos died in Biafra than during the era of slave trade. In the list of the worst genocidal crimes of the 20th century that was committed against humanity, the death of 1 in 15 Biafrans was ranked 5th. I left Nigeria for the USA because I wanted to stay afar from Biafra. Back in June 1970 and at age 15, in Onitsha, East Central State, Nigeria, I was confident that my school grades and scores in the American Scholastic Aptitude Test, called SAT, will guarantee me a scholarship to the USA. The scholarship letter that brought me to Oregon, USA, was dated September 10, 1973. So I had even wanted to leave Onitsha for Oregon earlier, in May 1973. I missed the September deadline and postponed my travel to mid-December 1973. Yet I didn't have a travel passport until December 28, 1973. For those reasons, I changed the date of my visa interview to March 1974. The US Consulate in Victoria Island, Lagos, issued me a visa on March 21, 1974, which I picked up the following afternoon. 24 hours later, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Saturday, March 23, 1974, I was passing inside the Ikeja Airport of Lagos, Nigeria. In 1976, that airport was renamed the Murtala Mohammed International Airport. 2 hours later, I had taken a seat in a Pan Am aircraft for my first airplane flight. That flight to the USA was an overwhelming experience. 48 hours after I left our compound, that was adjacent to Uzo Igwe Primary School, Asaba, Nigeria, I was in 36 Butler Hall, Monmouth, Oregon. My flight to Oregon included a brief stopover at the John F. Kennedy Airport. Prior to my first airplane flight of March 23, 1974, from the Ikeja Airport of Nigeria, the closest I came to an aircraft was to the Russian-made MiG-17 jet fighters that strapped Onitsha, Biafra, with its machine gun fire. Those Russian military aircrafts were purchased by the Nigerian Air Force and flown by foreign mercenary pilots. The war policy of the Nigerian Air Force was to bomb first and ask questions later. In Biafra, we used bombed-out buildings that were surrounded by rubbles as our playgrounds. In the last 30 months of the 1960s, the Russian-made Ilyushin IL-28 jet bombers dropped bombs on hospitals, markets, and refugee camps in Biafra. The Russian jet fighters and bombers flew to Onitsha from the airports in Benin City and Port Harcourt. In early 1968, the MiG-17 jet fighters and the Ilyushin IL-28 jet bombers frequently raided our refugee camps in the Enu-Onitsha neighborhood of Onitsha, Biafra. In February 1968, and at 14 Mba Road, Onitsha, I was almost killed from a hail of machine gun fire from a MiG-17 jet fighter that took off from Benin City. The following month, we fled from Onitsha, and the house at 14 Mba Road, Onitsha, that we fled from was bombed to rubbles. From the 8th-day non-stop artillery bombardments of downtown Onitsha that began on October 4, 1967, to the capture of Onitsha that occurred on March 20, 1968, half of the residents of Enu-Onitsha quarters of Onitsha were refugees from the Fege and Odapo quarters of Onitsha. During the 8th-day non-stop artillery bombardments of Fege and Odapo, my family of 9 fled from our house at 4BA Bunadaza Street, Odapo. We sought refuge in the house of my maternal grandfather, Chieka Balong, at 6C Wilkinson Road, Onitsha, Enu-Onitsha. On the 8th day, 15,000 heavily armed Nigerian soldiers crossed the River Niger to land in Onitsha. The Nigerian army captured downtown Onitsha. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I witnessed Nigerian soldiers engaging Biafran soldiers in fierce gun battles at Metropolitan College and fighting to capture the Obiokose Primary School that was converted as the Onitsha headquarters of the Biafran Army, which was right next door to our residence. Woken up by non-stop all-night gun firings, I stepped outside at 4 o'clock that morning of October 12, 1967. I saw 2 Biafran soldiers huddling in my maternal grandmother's cocoyam farm behind 6C Wilkinson Road. My grandmother passed away 9 months earlier, and her farm was untended. I saw both soldiers removing their Biafran army uniform and changing into civilian uniform. 30 minutes later, I saw those 2 Biafran soldiers fleeing with refugees along Oka Road and towards St. Charles Borromeo Hospital and towards Mpo. In mid-October 1967, and in downtown Onitsha, 15,000 soldiers died within a few days of close combat fighting. That was the reason 1,000 Biafran soldiers changed into civilian clothes and fled with refugees. My mother was then 28 years old. She fled with her 7 children to seek refuge in the house her mother, Obam Okudo, was born. The Okudo family house was 7-mile walk and at Nkwele Ogidi. As we were fleeing from Onitsha, and in the early morning of the 12th of October 1967, I witnessed a house-to-house gun battle. I saw a Biafran soldier crouched in a brush that was a stroll away and at the intersection of Wilkinson Road and Metropolitan College. That Biafran soldier was firing his automatic Satima rifle at presumably Nigerian soldiers who were trying to capture the Biafran military headquarters. 4 months earlier, and like all schools in Biafra, Obiokosi Primary School and the nearby Metropolitan College were closed. Schools were converted into Biafran military barracks and refugee camps. Unknown to us, Biafran refugees, 15,000 Nigerian soldiers that took no prisoners at nearby Asaba were everywhere in Onitsha. 5 days earlier, in Asaba, on October 7, 1967, 700 unarmed male civilians were gunned down and buried in mass graves. Unarmed civilians were gunned down at Ogbo Eke Market Square, Asaba, and at Ogbo Osowa, Asaba, at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, Asaba, at St. Patrick's College, Asaba, and at Cable Point, Asaba. Colonel Murtala Mohammed, the future president of Nigeria, was the commanding officer of the Nigerian soldiers that gunned down those 700 unarmed civilian men. After the dance of death killing spree, Asaba was described as a ghost town and as a town with women and no men. Please allow me to quote the London Observer issue of January 21, 1968. The greatest single massacre occurred in the Igbo town of Asaba, where 700 Igbo males were lined up and shot. That was the reason we fled from the advancing Nigerian soldiers during the first battle of Onitsha. On the early morning of October 12, 1967, and after 8 days of non-stop artillery bombardments that originated from the west bank of the River Niger at Asaba, 15,000 Nigerian soldiers made a surprise landing and for a few days captured the east bank of the River Niger at Onitsha. Throughout the 30-month war, the advancing Nigerian army outgunned and outmanned the retreating Biafran army by 4-1. Each Nigerian soldier in that bloody Onitsha battle that cost the life of 15,000 soldiers was heavily armed to the teeth. In the ensuing gunfighting and pandemonium of the early morning of October 12, 1967, we, the Ndi Onitsha refugees of Umuasele village, fled in the opposite direction and away from downtown Onitsha. My family began our flight along Wilkinson Road. 30 seconds along Wilkinson Road, a spent rifle bullet shell fell a few inches in front of my feet, proving that Nigerian soldiers were in our backyards. We rested for a few days in Nkwalogidi before fleeing deeper to Oka, Biafra, and in November 1967. On the 19th of January 1968, Oka was captured by Nigerian soldiers. We barely escaped. My family fled from Oka and sought refuge in my paternal uncle's house at 14 Mba Road in Onitsha. Back in October 1967, in Onitsha, Biafra, we were fleeing from the heavy artillery bombardments that were originating from the west bank of the River Niger at Asaba. Those artillery bombardments drove the refugees as well as some soldiers out of downtown Onitsha. The Nigerian artillery bombardments, quote unquote, softened Onitsha for their follow-up man-to-man military offensive that began on October 12, 1967. On the later date, daredevil Colonel Murtala Mohammed led a terrifying amphibious assault of a Nigerian 10-boat armada that ferried 15,000 well-armed soldiers across the River Niger and from Asaba to Onitsha. After 8 days of non-stop artillery shelling, those 15,000 Nigerian soldiers fiercely engaged poorly armed and fewer Biafran soldiers. The fighting was house to house and lasted from October 4th through 12th, 1967. Those military bombardments of Onitsha were executed under the guidance of the future president of Nigeria, Colonel Murtala Mohammed. The portrait of Murtala Mohammed is on the Nigerian 20 naira currency. He is the namesake of Nigeria's Murtala Mohammed International Airport. The aircraft bombing raids of Onitsha were at their peak in the few days before March 20, 1968, the day the city was captured. Egyptian pilots flew the Ilyushin IL-28 jet bombers, and pilots of European ancestry flew the MiG-17F jet fighters. The MiG-17F was flown by 16 foreign mercenaries, such as the former UK's Royal Air Force pilot John Pallister and South African RAF trained pilot Eres Klutwig and Briton Paul Martin. As a British mercenary pilot, Mike Thompsett was extravagantly paid 1,000 British pounds per month. That was almost 1,000 times the salary of a Nigerian soldier. In February 1968, the 36-feet-long MiG-17 jet fighter was routinely flown past our temporary residence at 14 Mba Road, Onitsha, Biafra. The MiG-17 was flown by mercenary pilot Mike Thompsett. MiG-17 was a high subsonic aircraft that was first flown in 1950. Throughout that 30-month-long war, which ended on January 15, 1970, the Biafran army did not possess anti-aircraft missiles or air defense systems. But children hear better than adults and warned us when the MiG-17 was 3 miles away. Children, not dogs, heard the jet engine whines of this MiG-17. Children alerted the adults whenever the Nigerian jet fighter or bomber that departs from Benin City is flying from downtown Onitsha to uptown Onitsha. Those alarms from children gave us time to scramble into our underground bunkers and do so before the MiG-17 jet fighter arrived in our neighborhood. We sought refuge inside an underground bunker that was beside the house of Uncle John Emeagwali at 14 Mba Road, Onitsha. That house was destroyed during the Nigerian artillery bombardments that were aimed to drive the Biafran soldiers away. Those artillery bombardments made it easier for the Nigerian army to capture Onitsha and overrun the commercial city by the early morning of March 21, 1968. About 4 hours earlier, that house at 14 Mba Road was razed to the ground by the Nigerian artillery bombardments that were fired from Abagana to Onitsha. My family of 9 narrowly escaped death. We escaped to Oba Biafra and from a soon-to-be bombed house, and did so in the late evening of March 20, 1968. That night, we were among the 10,000 Onitsha refugees that slept at the Merchants of Light School, Oba, Biafra. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, there was a huge influx of refugees who alerted us of the heavy fighting in Onitsha. Fearing for their lives, all the refugees that camped outdoors overnight at the Merchants of Light School took flight to Nnewi, Nobi, and Oketiti. So we fled from 14 Mba Road, Onitsha, and did so only 4 hours before the Nigerian soldiers began to heavily bombard and enter into the city of Onitsha. The MiG-17 jet fighters that bombed Onitsha were marked Nigerian Air Force NAF 623 or 625. That jet fighter had a top speed of 711 miles per hour and a range of 510 miles. The NAF 625 takes off from Benin City. After Port Harcourt was captured, it took off from that city. One of the bloodiest fighting of the Nigerian Civil War lasted 2 months, 2 weeks, and 2 days. That heavy casualty fighting was from March 8, 1968 through May 24, 1968. The Nigerian army was victorious and finally captured the important city of Port Harcourt. My ancestral hometown of Onitsha, Biafra, was captured 2 months earlier and on March 20, 1968. On July 19, 1969, and after an extended air raid within Biafra, the MiG-17F that shot at me and did so while I was tending my small garden at 14 Mba Road, Onitsha, ran out of fuel and crashed 200 yards short of its runway in Port Harcourt. The only casualty was its only occupant, the British mercenary RAF pilot named Mike Thompson, who shot at me 60 months earlier at 14 Mba Road, Onitsha. As a souvenir, I kept the hot 23 by 115 millimeter shell casing from the NR-23 cannon that the MiG-17F jet fighter fired at me. That big jet fighter shell casing landed 1 foot beside my feet. That shell casing was very hot when I first picked it up. Fast forward 7 years from 1968, I'm from Onitsha, Biafra, to Corvallis, Oregon, USA. I was living with a former pilot named Fred Merrifield. Fred co-founded the engineering firm CH2M back in 1946. Nearly 6 decades before I met Fred Merrifield, he was also a Royal Air Force pilot who was shot down in the First World War. Merrifield suffered severe injuries that made it impossible for him to father children. His company, CH2M, now employs 20,000 persons and has a revenue of $5 billion a year. So Fred Merrifield was a man of means and wisdom. I lived with the British-born Fred Merrifield and his also British-born wife Anne from late 1975 to early 1976. They had no children and was 31 years younger than Fred Merrifield. Three of us lived in their beautiful mansion at 2540 Southwest Whiteside Drive, Corvallis, Oregon. I was asked what books inspired me to travel to the USA. At age 9, I read what my father read. My father subscribed to two Nigerian newspapers, the West African Pilot and the Daily Times. He also subscribed to two American magazines, the Reader's Digest and the Rosicrucian Digest. As an aside, the Rosicrucian Digest describes Sir Isaac Newton as a mystic and an alchemist, just as I've been labeled a member of the Illuminati, a secret society of celebrities that use their fame, wealth, and power to control the world. In mid-1964, and at age 9, in Abo, Midwest region, Nigeria, my father bought for me the novel Gulliver's Travels. It was subtitled Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World. Gulliver's Travels was written by Jonathan Swift. In late 1964, I read a second novel, The Pilgrim's Progress. It was subtitled From This World to That Which Is to Come. The Pilgrim's Progress, published in the year 1678, was published in the year 1678 and was written by John Bunyan. At one time, The Pilgrim's Progress was second only to the Bible in popularity. The Pilgrim's Progress was the first novel to be written in the English language. In early 1966, and in St. George's Grammar School, Obinomba, Midwest Region, Nigeria, I read the novel called Treasure Island that was written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Looking back to my formative years, my literary and scientific role models were from faraway England, not from Nigeria, that was my country of birth. My interest in fast calculations began at age 9 in January 1964 in Abo, Nigeria. The fastest calculations that I did was solving 100 arithmetic problems in an hour. I practiced fast calculations every weekday evening and in the living room of our house that was along Benoba Road, Abo. In 1964, I was in class 5 of St. John's Primary School, Abo. As a 10-year-old, my goal was to score the highest in the mid-1965 Nigerian Common Entrance Examination and hopefully enroll in King's College, Lagos, or in St. Gregory's College, Lagos. That entrance exam was the Nigerian equivalent for 10-year-olds of the American Scholastic Aptitude Test called SAT. In December 1965, I earned my Standard 6 certificate called the First School Living Certificate from St. John's Primary School in Boji, Abo. My entrance examinations of mid-1965 Nigeria were for the January 1966 entries into King's College, Lagos, Christ the King College, Onitsha, and St. Patrick's College, Asaba. Nigeria followed the British naming system, which used the word college to describe what Americans call middle and high schools, or 7th through 12th grades. To my father's surprise, I was not admitted into King's College in faraway Lagos or into any academically rigorous college that he ranked as top 5 in Nigeria. Towards late 1965, I was hurriedly admitted into St. George's College, Obinamba. That school was an hour's drive from Abo. I enrolled in St. George's in late January 1966 and a few days after the military coup in Nigeria. 15 months later, the counter-coup and civil uprisings forced me to withdraw from St. George's College. The school was a new Catholic boarding school that was completely competently managed by an Irish priest named Thomas Brendan Kennedy, who was born in Cork, Ireland. St. George was the 3rd century patron saint of England and a Roman soldier and warrior saint who was decapitated. Post-colonial African schools are named after African-born heroes, such as Sheikh Anta Diop and Obafemi Awolowo universities. Africans are learning from the French people who wear their history of science on their sleeves. Dozens of streets in Paris, France, are named after French scientists who contributed to science. Boulevard Louis Pasteur was named after the 19th century biologist who discovered pasteurization and microbial fermentation and the principles of vaccination. On September 30, 2010, I had a day-long urban hike through the streets of Paris, France. I learned that nearly 100 Parisian streets, boulevards, and squares were named after French mathematicians. I'm a 21st century mathematician who is the subject of biography reports that are titled Famous Mathematicians and Their Contributions. I'm studied alongside mathematicians like Pythagoras, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein. For me, it was a surreal experience to stroll across streets named after French mathematicians and realize that in 1,000 years, a mathematician will be driving across Philip Emeagwali Road in Nigeria or USA. At ages 11 and 12, I was an altar boy who helped the priest during a Catholic service. I was trained as an altar boy by a Catholic priest named Thomas Brendan Kennedy. On Sunday mornings, I traveled with Reverend Kennedy. We traveled from St. George's College, Obinamba, to small Nigerian villages such as Obiaroko, Umutu, Abavo, and Abraka. From late January 1966 through late April 1967, I sang in the Catholic church choir of the small villages named Obinamba and Obiaroko. We sang Gregorian chants, the traditional Catholic music in Latin text. My favorite was Dies Ira, Dies Illa. As an 11-year-old boy, altar boy, in the Catholic Church, Thomas Kennedy was my role model, and I considered becoming a priest. At age 12 and in late April 1967, my mother suddenly showed up in St. George's College, Obinamba. I knew she came to take me away because the Igbos living outside Igbo land were fleeing back to Igbo land. Talks of a bloody civil war were in the air. I fled with my mother from Obinamba to our residence at the nurses' quarters, General Hospital, Abo. The following day, my family fled to 4BA Bunadasia Street, Odapo Quarters, Onitsha. On October 4, 1967, the Nigerian army at the west bank of the River Niger began 8 days of continuous shelling of the Fege and Odapo quarters of Onitsha. That shelling caused all the residents of downtown Onitsha to flee. Over the next 27 months, my family fled through 8 refugee camps in Ogidi, Oka, Enu Onitsha, Oba, Nnewi, Oka Etiti, Ndoni, and Fege Onitsha. In April 1970, and 3 months after the Nigerian Civil War was over, I found it awkward and demoralizing to return to St. George's College, Obinamba, and re-enroll in Class 2. I'd be 3 years behind my former classmates, who were then in Class 5. The Nigerian Civil War forced me to repeat Class 2 for the 4 years that were inclusive of January 1967 through December 1970. I did not return because it was humiliating to be 3 years behind my former classmates at St. George's College, Obinamba. Fast forward 19 years, I was in the news headlines for my 1989 supercomputer discovery. The Old Boys, or Alumni Society of St. George's College, Obinamba, sent their congratulations. Because I didn't return to Obinamba after the war was over, they presumed that I was one of the 1 million Biafrans that were starved to death in refugee camps or who were killed in my ancestral hometown of Onitsha that became the bloodiest battlefield in the history of African wars. When the Nigerian Civil War ended on January 15, 1970, and after 30 months of fighting, 1 in 15 Biafrans had died. I decided not to be humiliated by spending 4 years at the 8th grade of St. George's College, Obinamba. Instead, I enrolled in mid-1970 as a new student in Christ the King College, Onitsha, called CKC. However, I didn't finish at CKC. In March 1972, I left Christ the King College, and after a year and a half, or after completing the American equivalent of the 9th grade. 1.5 years after I left Christ the King College, I won a scholarship to the United States. My scholarship letter was dated September 10, 1973. That scholarship changed my direction from Nigeria to USA. About 10 days later, I was in Lagos for the first time. To put my sense of accomplishment in perspective, after the brutal 30-month-long war was over, and in the early 1970s, I could not name an 18-year-old in Igbo land that won an academic-based scholarship to the USA. I qualified myself to win a scholarship to the USA. I was an independent scholar who returned from Ibuzo, Midwest State, to challenge the General Certificate of Education examinations of the University of London. It was an entrance examination to the University of London that in reality became my high school diploma. I never earned the standard secondary school diploma called the West African School Certificate. The reason was that only those registered in a secondary school, can register for the West African School Certificate examinations. I left Christ the King College, Onitsha, in March 1972 to study alone in Ibuzo, Nigeria, and do so until late October 1972. Ironically, I earned the advanced level General Certificate of Education diploma that was dated November 1972 and earned it from the West African Examination Council. I earned it in both mathematics and physics. Furthermore, I earned the advanced level diploma before I earned the ordinary level diploma that was dated January 1973 and issued by the University of London. The advanced level diploma was 2 years of study ahead of the ordinary level diploma. So I was 2 years ahead of my former classmates in the extremely competitive Christ the King College, Onitsha. In early 1973, I was determined to leave Nigeria, but I didn't have a Nigerian mentor or a contact in the USA. My calling cards to American schools were my test scores from the University of London's entrance examination and from the American TOEFL, or Test of English as a Foreign Language, American SAT, or Scholastic Aptitude Tests and Achievement Tests. My strengths were in mathematics and physics. I had only 1 shilling, which I spent to buy postage to only one American school in Monmouth, Oregon. Yet I expected to overcome the 1 in a million odds and win a scholarship to Oregon, USA. My scholarship letter that was dated September 10, 1973 was sent from Monmouth, Oregon, USA to my address in Asaba, Nigeria. In 1973, I was living at 6C Wilkinson Road, Onitsha, but it wasn't a reliable postal address for receiving a scholarship letter from the USA. For those reasons, I received my letters from the USA in care of James Emeagwali, my father, then working as a nursing superintendent at the General Hospital, Asaba. So my letters from the USA were sent to me at the General Hospital, Asaba, even though I was never hospitalized in Nigeria. For the 6 months following September 21, 1973, I made several trips from near the General Hospital, Asaba, to the post office in Onitsha. I came to Onitsha to mail important letters, such as my scholarship acceptance letter to the USA. I made that 4-hour trek because I didn't have faith in the post office in Asaba. Furthermore, I made trips to the Student Advisory Committee of the East Central State Ministry of Education, Enugu. I journeyed to Enugu to get a clearance letter that asserted that my proposed field of study was not available in Nigeria. That clearance letter was my pretext to study in the USA instead of in Nigeria. After receiving my clearance letter, I traveled to the Nigerian Passport Office at 27 Kakawa Street, Lagos. The chief passport officer in Lagos had a reputation as the most corrupt man in Nigeria. I had my F1 visa interview on March 20, 1974. I was interviewed by Mr. Glassel, the consular officer at the US Embassy, Lagos. After a 6-month delay in getting my Nigerian passport and my American F1 student visa, I left my hometowns of Asaba and Onitsha, Nigeria, for my new residence at 36 Butler Hall, Monmouth, Oregon. On the early morning of Saturday, March 23, 1974, when I left Onitsha via the Midwest line, Abuja, the future capital of Nigeria, wasn't in my vocabulary. In 1974, Abuja wasn't on the map of Nigeria. Half a century later, I have yet to visit Abuja. Thursday, March 21, 1974, was an important date in my life. The previous night, I slept on a thin mat on the bare concrete floor of a tiny room in the backyard of 49 Okesuna Street, Lagos. I came to the US Embassy in Victoria Island, Lagos, to pick up my travel passport that was stamped with an F1 student visa that was approved 24 hours earlier. After picking up my F1 student visa, I took a taxi that was a 5-passenger Peugeot 404 sedan and traveled from Lagos Motor Park to Asaba Main Market. From 3 o'clock in the morning, I made the perilous, lengthy trek to my parents' house that was along Nebisi Road. Their compound in Asaba was next to that of a Catholic priest named Patrick Uboko. Their rental 2-bedroom apartment was a short stroll past Asaba Girls Grammar School called AGGS and adjacent to Uzuigwe Primary School that was near St. Patrick's College and General Hospital, Asaba. That night, I slept for only 2 hours. Then I spent the next 12 hours dashing around to get a traveler's check of $134 from the Barclays Bank that was near Bright Street, Onitsha. Then I returned library books to Onitsha Public Library. Finally, I hugged my friends and relatives at 6 Wilkinson Road, Onitsha. That evening, I returned to Asaba to spend my last night with my parents and siblings. After late-night conversations with my parents and a 2-hour sleep, I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning of Saturday, March 23, 1974. My flight to Portland, Oregon, USA, required that I arrive at the Ikeja Airport of Lagos and be there in 10 hours after I woke up. I was then 19 years old and had never seen an airplane that was parked on the ground. My first thought of studying in the USA began 4 years earlier, in mid-1970 at age 15, when I was living along Venn Road, Onitsha, Nigeria. After the Nigerian Civil War ended on January 15, 1970, the economy of Onitsha was in total shambles, and coming to the USA in the early 1970s was a far-fetched dream that evoked laughter whenever I mentioned it. Their laughter stopped after I received a scholarship from Monmouth, Oregon. That scholarship took effect from September 10, 1973. Around 7:30 in the morning of March 23, 1974, I said goodbye to my parents and to the 5 of my 7 siblings that were still at home. I also said goodbyes to tenants in our compound. At about 5 o'clock that evening, I boarded a Pan American aircraft for my 36-hour flight from Ikeja Airport of Nigeria to the airport in Portland, Oregon. My Lagos-Portland flight was 36 hours long because it included 4 stopovers in Monrovia, Liberia, Dakar, Senegal, New York City, and Chicago. In early 1974, only a few Africans traveled to the USA. For that reason, my Pan Am flight originated from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. To fill up the airline seats, it picked up passengers from 1 or 2 stopovers in perhaps Kinshasa, Congo, and then picked up about a dozen passengers in Lagos, Nigeria. As an aside, Pan Am built many of the original airports in West Africa. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Pan Am and BOAC, the acronym for the British Overseas Airways Corporation, were the 2 major airlines that served Africa. The idea of coming to the USA came into my mind in mid-1970 at age 15. One late school day afternoon, I saw my classmate at Christ the King College, Onitsha, Chris Chiedu Okudele. Chiedu held a tiny pamphlet that piqued my interest. It was a slim college brochure from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, USA. That MIT brochure was where I got the idea of coming to the USA. But it seemed far-fetched at the time and place, which was about 6 months after the Biafran War ended and the Onitsha economy was completely ruined. I expected to come to the USA because I was considered a top student and therefore assumed that I will be offered a scholarship to MIT or Harvard. Fast forward to September 10, 1973. I got a scholarship to Oregon, USA, and for that reason, I never applied to MIT or Harvard. In late May 1973, and 3 months before I got a scholarship to the USA, we had an extended family meeting at 6 Wilkinson Road, Onitsha. That was the compound of my maternal grandfather, Chieka Balong. That meeting was chaired by my maternal uncle, Orofo Balong, and maternal aunt, Nkemdelin Asuoku. The purpose of that meeting was to persuade me to give up my unrealistic ambition to study in the USA. In May 1973, I was 18 years old and unemployed. If I was gainfully employed in 1973, my lifetime salary couldn't even pay for my first year of study in the USA. So to my uncle and aunt and everyone else traveling from Onitsha, Nigeria to the USA and raising the travel, tuition, and boarding funds to live and study in America for 4 years and doing them in May 1973 seemed as far-fetched as Nigeria aiming to send a Nigerian astronaut to the moon. For those reasons, my uncle and aunt cautioned me to be realistic in my ambitions and to instead lower my expectations and continue my studies in Nigerian universities, then only admitting about 1,000 students a year into campuses in the 6 cities of Lagos, Ibadan, Ife, Zaria, Benin City, and Nsukka. In contrast, the USA has 5,000 universities. By mid-September 1973, I was jobless, restless, and killing time at 6 Wilkinson Road, Onitsha, that was located a short stroll from the Metropolitan College. If I'm not in Onitsha, I might hang around the neighborhood of St. Patrick's College, Asaba, or be at 41 Bishop Anyogu Road, Enugu. On my 19th birthday, it seemed my chances of coming to the USA had all but vanished My biggest obstacle to coming to the USA was this. I had to receive an F1 student visa from the Consulate General of the USA in Lagos, Nigeria. A student visa to the USA was extremely difficult to get. Legend has it that only one F1 student visa was issued in a day in 1973 and at the USA Embassy in Lagos, Nigeria. The minor requirements for an F1 student visa to the USA included the Nigerian passport that was then very difficult and very expensive to obtain. I paid the equivalent of 2 years' salary to the Nigerian Chief Passport Officer at 27 Kakawa Street, Lagos. Officially, my payment was a refundable repatriation fee, but my repatriation fee went into the personal bank account of the Nigerian Chief Passport Officer. Other minor student visa requirements were passport size photos, immunization records, and medical reports. Until late September 1973, I couldn't even pay for the passport size photos that were required by the US Consulate General. In the 1973 post-Nigerian Civil War economy, it seemed unrealistic that I could pay in advance the required 1 year's tuition and board, and then provide my personal bank accounts with enough money to pay for 4 years tuition and board in the USA, and do them before age 18, and at a time I couldn't afford the bus fare to travel to the Nigerian Passport Office that was at 27 Kakawa Street off Broad Street behind Bookshop House, Lagos, Ireland, Lagos. By late May 1973, I was relenting on my ambition to study in the USA. I was unemployed. In May 1973, 3 teachers at Asaba Girls Grammar School told me that I was qualified to teach mathematics and physics in their school. In my search for a job, I traveled 70 miles away from Onitsha to the Ministry of Education in Enugu, East Central State, Nigeria, to apply for a job in the Nigeria of 1973. A formal resume, completed job application form, letters of reference, and background investigations weren't required. In June 1973, and at age 18, I was offered a job to teach mathematics and physics in an all-girls secondary school in Umudioka, East Central State, Nigeria. I got the teaching position by merely presenting my diplomas, both the General Certificate of Education at the ordinary and advanced levels. I received the first diploma from the University of London in January 1973, and after 5 external examinations in as many subjects that I took in Onitsha, I received the second diploma called the General Certificate of Education at the advanced level. I received that advanced level diploma from the West African Examination Council in November 1972 and by external examinations that I took in Onitsha. Ironically, I was awarded the advanced level diploma before the ordinary level diploma. That was as unusual as earning a master's degree before the bachelor's degree. In March 1972, I was an independent student living behind and between the General Hospital and the Catholic Church at Ibuzo, Midwest State, Nigeria. I studied alone and hard. I was confident, not only that I also took my examinations, not only that, I also took my examinations in reverse order. Fast forward a year to May 1973. I was unemployed and socializing with 3 secondary school teachers that we are living in our compound in Asaba, Nigeria. Asaba is the sister city to Onitsha. Asaba was on the western edge of the River Niger. The 3 secondary school teachers that I was socializing with told me I was qualified to teach mathematics and physics in their school. In fact, I was surprised to learn that, even though I was only 18 years old, that I was just as qualified as they were. With that information, I saw myself in a new and positive light, and encouraged by their recommendations, I traveled to the Ministry of Education in Enugu, East Central State. To teach in Asaba, I had to apply in person in the Ministry of Education in Benin City, the capital of Midwest State. East Central State was my first choice because I had made several trips to Enugu and I was always welcome to stay with my mother's cousin, Mrs. Eunice Ndulue, who lived upstairs at 41 Bishop Anyogo Street, Enugu. In late May 1973, I applied to teach mathematics and physics in any secondary school in East Central State, Nigeria. A week after I applied, the Ministry of Education in Enugu posted me to teach mathematics and physics at an all-girls secondary school in Umudioka, East Central State. That girls' school was 9 miles outside Onitsha and seems to have been renamed to perhaps St. Kizito Girls Secondary School. I was 18 years old when I presented myself to the principal and vice principal of the Girls Secondary School in Umudioka. I introduced myself as the school's newest teacher for mathematics and physics. The girls were pleased to see me, but the principal wasn't pleased that an 18-year-old boy was sent to teach 18-year-old girls. I sensed the female teachers giving me the cold shoulder. That was the reason I abandoned the science teaching position at the girls' secondary school in Umudioka. My rejection as a teacher in Umudioka left me jobless, but it gave me the free time to daydream about coming to the USA. I traveled to Enugu to read and research in the one-room British Council Library and in the much larger East Central State Library. I was one of the few dozen patrons that were given borrowing privileges at the Onitsha Public Library and at the British Council Library in Enugu. In late May 1973, I made a significant discovery inside the reading room of St. Patrick's College, Asaba, Nigeria. That reading room had only one hefty book and one desk. The book was called the College Blue Book. That 1970 edition of the College Blue Book was a comprehensive listing of all the 2,000 universities in the USA. 50 years later, the College Blue Book expanded to become a comprehensive guide to 12,000 institutions. The College Blue Book featured an extensive information on admission requirements, tuition fees, scholarships for US citizens, student life, and essential information that a prospective student should know. In late May 1973, I was unemployed, and therefore I had the time to write letters of inquiry to American schools. In early 1973, the first person I knew by name who was living on the continent of North America was a pen friend, a teenager named Audrey Frick, who was living in St. John's, a city on Newfoundland, Ireland, off Canada's Atlantic coast. I lost touch with Audrey Frick, but 4.5 decades later, when I tried to once again re-establish contact with her, I learned that a teenager named Audrey Murray Frick, born in 1956 in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, died on July 21, 1974 in St. John's, Newfoundland, and died 4 months after I arrived in the USA. In 1973, I preferred to study in the USA, not in England or West Germany or Canada. My problem was that in 1973, I had no contacts in the USA, nor did I know any person who traveled to the USA. I couldn't name 5 Americans of African descent. In January 1974, I saw a Black American for the first time. He was a young Marine guarding the gate of the US Embassy in Lagos. In February 1974, I was briefly staying at 49 Okesuna Street, Lagos. I came to Lagos from Onitsha to seek an F1 student visa. I had won a scholarship to study in Oregon, USA. As a diversion, my former classmate in Christ the King College, Onitsha, East Central State, named Chude Opade, and I went to see the new movie, Shaft. That movie was an eye-opener. It was the first time I watched the USA and Black America on a giant screen. To say that Shaft impressed me will be an understatement. As a prospective student to the USA, the college blue book that I discovered in St. Patrick's College, Asaba, provided me the vital information that I badly needed. In late May 1973, I had only 1 shilling or 12 pence in savings. The postage cost to the USA was 9 pence. So I had only one shot at one of the 2,000 institutions in the USA. Using my intuition on which school is most likely to award me a scholarship, I wrote to Stan Kenyon, a university registrar in Monmouth, Oregon, USA. I had obtained Stan Kenyon's contact from the college blue book that was the only book in the only reading room in Asaba of May 1973. Because I was unemployed, I didn't have another 9 pence to write a second letter to the USA, which will double my chances of coming to America. For that financial reasons, I gave up on applying for university admission to the 2,000 schools in the USA. As a Black African-born supercomputer scientist in the US, who conducted his research alone, my wilderness years were from June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, through July 4, 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico. During my decade and a half as a supercomputer scientist, I felt like the rebel scientist punished and exiled to the inhabitable region and the frigid winters of the Russian Siberia. On the Christmas Day of 1989, the year I won the highest award in supercomputing, I was alone and I programmed the 65,536 or the 2 raised to power 16 slowest processors in the world and across an internet that's a global network of those processors. I programmed my 64 binary thousand processors to solve as many initial boundary value problems in mathematical physics. I discretized and reduced each of my problems to a system of equations of computational linear algebra. That was my mathematical representation of a physical problem, such as the problem of foreseeing the climate change that can occur within a region of the atmosphere of the Earth, or the problem of predicting the sea level rise within a region of the oceans of the Earth. On Christmas Day of 1989, I programmed for 16 hours, and I ate only peanut butter sandwiches and apples for my lunch and dinner. It was on the 31st of December 1989 that I ended my exile to the unknown field of knowledge that was then in the realm of science fiction and now known as the world's fastest computing. I ended that exile in 1989 because I won the highest award in supercomputing that computer scientists refer to as the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing. That was the highest acknowledgement of a person's contribution to supercomputing. For those reasons, I received my first significant media attention. I also received the attention of scientists who rejected my contributions to the world's fastest computer. For years, most computer scientists mocked the technology of using the world's slowest processors to attempt the world's fastest computing and dismissed it as a tremendous waste of everybody's time. Today, the world's fastest computer is powered by millions of off-the-shelf processors instead of one custom manufactured processor. That paradigm shift or change in the way we look at the supercomputer is my contribution to computer science, and computer science textbooks have been revised to account for the new definition of the world's fastest computer. During the 1970s and 80s, my contribution to parallel supercomputing, the key technology that powers the world's fastest computers, supercomputers, was rejected a dozen times. If rejection was an Olympic game, I would have won its gold medal. I began programming the world's fastest computers on June 20, 1974, and began by programming a scalar supercomputer that was at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, USA. 7 years earlier, that supercomputer was rated as the world's fastest computer. In Corvallis, Oregon, I stood out because the Pacific Northwest region was one of the whitest regions in the US. Hence, Oregonians that never met me presumed that I was white. Often, I did things backwards, just like I earned the General Certificate of Education at the advanced level before earning that certificate at the ordinary level. I won a scholarship to a university in Oregon, and did so 6 months before I was admitted into that university. I applied for admission when I received a scholarship from the USA that was dated September 10, 1973. That scholarship letter was my turning point. After I arrived in the USA on March 24, 1974, I discovered that Stan Kenyon worked behind the scenes to get me that scholarship. In late March 1974, I was one of only 3 Nigerians that were living in the small town of Monmouth, Oregon. In 1974, Monmouth was a strikingly old-fashioned, tight-knit community of 6,000 persons that had no resident black family. Monmouth had no public transportation, including a bus service. Monmouth is within the Willamette Valley, an area that has lots of bike trails, winding through covered bridges and scenic backcountry roads. In 1974, it was against the law to sell alcohol in Monmouth, Oregon. In Oregon, a question that I was often asked was this: where are you from? Nigeria, Africa, I answer. Why did you choose Monmouth instead of New York? I learned about Monmouth in May 1973 and from the college Blue Book. It was the only book in the reading room of St. Patrick's College, Asaba, Nigeria, a secondary school that was a short walk from my residence. I picked Monmouth, Oregon, because my intuition told me to start from a very small town. When I began supercomputing back on June 20, 1974, in Corvallis, Oregon, USA, I did not know anybody that was interested in physically executing the fastest computing in the world and doing so across the slowest processors in the world and across an internet that's a global network of those processors. But if they existed elsewhere, I could count them on the fingers of one hand. In 1974, the term supercomputer scientist was not in any computer science textbook. There were no journal articles on a world's fastest computer that's powered by 1 billion processors. No textbooks, no courses, no research grants, no conferences. A radical change on how we look at the supercomputer occurred on July 4, 1989. It occurred because my 65,536 slowest processors in the world defeated the fastest computer in the world and defeated it by an overwhelming margin and defeated it by solving the most compute-intensive problems at the crossroad where the frontiers of mathematics, physics, and computing intersect. Inventing the world's fastest computer demanded a deep knowledge of the most complicated mathematics. That was the precondition to harnessing millions of processors at once and to solving the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems. I'm the subject of school essays because I conclusively provided the quote-unquote final proof that harnessing up to 1 billion processors that outline a supercomputer is a viable path to finding the answers to some of the biggest questions at the frontiers of 21st century science and medicine, such as deeply understanding how COVID-19 spreads across Nigerian buses that pack passengers like sardines. I discovered that the first supercomputing across the world's slowest computers is not science fiction. My discovery made the news because I was the first person to answer the most difficult mathematical question arising at the intersection of physics and computer science. If just one processor stumbled, all 1 billion processors would fall at once. The world's fastest computation that I executed on July 4, 1989, and across the world's slowest processors was the final proof that supercomputers should be powered by up to 1 billion processors. My quest for the world's fastest computer began on June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. 15 years later, I was able to solve the most compute-intensive problem arising in computational mathematics and physics. In 1989, I was in the news for becoming the first person to discover how to harness the world's slowest processors and use them to solve the most compute-intensive problems in the world, and solve them at the world's fastest computer speed ever recorded. My paramount quest was to discover the hoped-for practical how-to knowledge that could be used to design the world's fastest computers. My new knowledge powers the world's fastest computers and took them to record-breaking speeds, and did so with millions of processors that each had its dedicated memory but were in constant dialogue with each other. Such state-of-the-art supercomputers are now used to run the highest resolution global climate models. Supercomputers are used to gain a deeper understanding of existential crises, such as how ocean waves and pathways contribute to the Earth's transport of pollutants, nutrients, and heat. As a black inventor, a few white supremacists wrongly credited my invention to some white inventors. The proof is that those impostors could not stand before an audience and deliver an impromptu original lecture explaining how they discovered the world's fastest computing, and then post that lecture as a podcast and YouTube video. On the other hand, this imposter syndrome affected some black attendees of my scientific lectures. They had inferiority complex and feared that I wouldn't live up to expectations as a genius. My answer is for them to compare my 1,000 podcasts and YouTube lectures in mathematics, physics, and computer science to those of the likes of Albert Einstein, who are still living. As a supercomputer scientist who came of age in the 1970s and 80s, my biggest obstacle was to overcome racism, not to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems. Historically, white supremacists work hard to discredit and diminish the contributions of any black genius that's described as having a higher IQ than Albert Einstein. I walked alone because I wasn't taken seriously in the 1970s and 80s, the decades I made my breakthrough discovery. There was an unspoken assumption about white supremacists that a black sub-Saharan African lacked the intellect needed to solve the most intractable problems in the fields of mathematics, physics, and computer science. Today, in their online fora, white supremacists argue that sub-Saharan Africa has not produced a mathematical genius who possessed the intellect of Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein. Their claim of intellectual superiority was, and it remains, the fundamental argument still used by online white hate groups and used to rationalize white supremacy and propagate their myth of black racial inferiority. Ironically, white supremacists unintentionally made me famous. In 1989, I made the news headlines as a quote-unquote black genius born in sub-Saharan Africa. I drew the attention of white supremacists because I provided an image of a black genius that was ranked alongside Albert Einstein. The racial stereotype was that a black person can only become famous as a boxer like Muhammad Ali or a singer like Michael Jackson. In 1975 and in Oregon, I had early white mentors and role models, such as the British-born Fred Merrifield, then 75 years old and a retired engineering professor. Fred Merrifield was a co-founder of CH2M, an engineering firm that worked on the 15.5-mile-long tunnel of London's sewage system and worked on the Panama Canal extension. CH2M now employs 20,000 persons and has a revenue of $5 billion a year. So Fred Merrifield was a man of means and wisdom. I lived with Fred Merrifield and his British-born wife Anne in 1975 and 1976. They had no children. Anne was 31 years younger than Fred Merrifield. Three of us lived in their beautiful mansion at 2540 Southwest Whiteside Drive, Corvallis, Oregon. The dinner guests at the Merrifields included the co-inventor of the transistor, the British-born William Shockley, who was controversial and was ostracized for promoting high IQ sperm banks. In 1,000 YouTube videos, I lectured only in prose. That's because I've been supercomputing for half a century. Other scientists must lecture with the aid of PowerPoints. I lectured on how to solve the most compute-intensive problems, such as constructing a high-resolution, centuries-long climate model and solve them across millions of processors. I worked alone to solve this problem because it was unfamiliar territory. The solutions that I discovered were not in any computer science textbook. In 1989, I was in the news because I was the only person that could solve the most compute-intensive problems. I solved such mathematical physics problems across an ensemble of 65,000 536 processors. The academic computer scientist must always copy the governing system of coupled partial differential equations of meteorology and must transfer those abstract and unfamiliar equations from his textbook to his PowerPoint slides. For me, Philip Emeagwali, I was the triple threat who was a research mathematician of the late 1970s, who became a research physicist of the early 1980s, who became a research supercomputer scientist of the mid-1980s, who entered the news headlines in 1989 and became known for his scientific discovery that parallel processing enables computers to be faster and enables the supercomputer to be super. The partial differential equation and parallel supercomputing were as much my natural dialects the way the Igbo language is my ancestral tongue. For those reasons, it should not come as a surprise when I invented the 9 Emeagwali equations. Because I invented those equations, I could deliver my lectures on my contributions to mathematics, physics, and computer science and post them across 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos. After 50 years of supercomputing, I delivered each lecture posted on YouTube and did so without using a single PowerPoint slide as my crunch. Solving the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problem via the fastest computing across the slowest processors is a century-long quest that began in 1922 as human computing executed by 64,000 persons. In 1989 and 1990, I was in local newspapers, both for reaching the finals of a citywide tennis tournament and for winning the highest award in supercomputing. The world's fastest computing is as competitive as playing a tennis match against Serena Williams. As a tennis player, I exploited my opponent's weaknesses, but respected their strengths. Tennis taught me many things, including how to fight and be mentally and physically stronger. However, solving the once-in-a-century problem arising at the crossroads of mathematics, physics, and computer science is rarer and more difficult than winning the votes as the all-time greatest tennis player. Being the first person to discover how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems and solve them across 1 million processors demanded a polymath who was a triple threat at the frontiers of knowledge in mathematics, physics, and computer science. The genius makes the typical exceptional. The genius possesses the ability to look at an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world and deeply understand it as beyond a new supercomputer and as a new internet in reality. Genius is the ability to see what others saw to be a rock and see it to be a diamond. My quest of the 1970s and 80s was for the world's fastest computer that solves the most compute-intensive problems in the world and solves them with the world's slowest processors. My new knowledge is used to find the deepest crude oil and natural gas that we are buried up to 7.7 miles below the surface of the earth, and to simulate their motions across one of the 159 producing oil fields in Nigeria and across one of the 65,000 oil fields around the world that include the supergiant oil fields in Abu Dhabi, Brazil, and Mexico. I was the first person to understand how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems and solve them across millions of processors. In brief, that problem is the system of 9 partial differential equations, which governs the initial boundary value problem that mathematically defines the motions of the crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that were flowing across a highly anisotropic and heterogeneous producing oil field. An oil field such as the Sakhalin Shelf in Russia's Far East is up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers deep. An oil field is often the size of a town. The genius deeply understands how and where to add 36 new partial derivative terms that mathematically encoded the temporal and convective inertial forces, and to add those new terms to the 45 existing partial derivative terms that mathematically encoded the pressure, viscous, and gravitational forces, and do so to make that system of 9 partial differential equations a more accurate representation of the producing oil field it governs. The genius can deeply understand how to harness the slowest processors in the world and use them to solve the most challenging problems in the world. The genius can solve the world's most compute-intensive problems and solve them at the world's fastest recorded speeds, and do so when it was considered impossible to solve them. The genius is the ordinary person that found the extraordinary in the ordinary. I'm studied in schools for my contributions to computer science, just as Albert Einstein is studied for his contributions to physics. For that reason, I'm often asked, should Albert Einstein be the role model for Black students? To the extent Philip Emeagwali is accepted as a role model for white students, Black students should reciprocate with Albert Einstein. Otherwise, my answer is no. Albert Einstein can't be the most inspiring role model for the Black science student in the USA or the Caribbean or Africa. For the same reason, Albert Einstein can't be the most inspiring role model for the physics student in China. Presumably, he or she must have read the racially derogatory remarks that Albert Einstein wrote in his travel diaries during his 1920s lecture tours through the Far East and Middle East. During Albert Einstein's 5.5-month voyage and lecture tours through Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Japan, and Palestine, Einstein wrote in his diary that Chinese are inferior to Europeans. For his xenophobic and racist commentaries, Albert Einstein can be the most inspiring role model for all physics students, especially for students who read his posthumously published book titled The Travel Diaries of Albert Einstein. In an email An African American student wrote that he received a C grade on his essay that was titled Albert Einstein and the Special Relativity. The following semester, the same student received an A grade on his essay that was titled Philip Emeagwali and the Supercomputer. The reason for this disparity is that young African Americans are inspired when they see themselves in my world's fastest computing. I've often wondered aloud, where did we get the idea that only a white person can be a genius? And how did America perfect the art of destroying black geniuses? My quest for the fastest computer began in the 1980s. I applied 10 times to program a supercomputer, and I was rejected those 10 times. In 1987, I was approved to program a supercomputer that was at the San Diego Supercomputer Center in San Diego, California. That supercomputer account was revoked when the administrator discovered I was black and African. As far as I know, I was the only supercomputer programmer in the USA that was dismissed and banned from programming supercomputers that were owned and operated for and by the US government. Looking back retrospectively, the famous African-American botanist George Washington Carver was born a slave, but yet he was admitted into an all-white university. A century later, and in 1987, I experienced more insidious racism than George Washington Carver did. In American science, the racism is deeply institutionalized. Several prominent white American scientists, including William Shockley and James Watson, argued that people of African descent are less intelligent than those of European descent. William Shockley advocated that black women should be discouraged from having children. As a black and African mathematician who invented the 9 Philip Emeagwali equations and who came of age in the 1970s, I struggled to get white mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists to acknowledge my contributions of the fastest computing across the slowest processors and to human knowledge. In 1989, I was given credit mainly because I submitted my invention anonymously to win the highest award in supercomputing. That prize made the news headlines. In retrospect, it was easier for George Washington Carver, who was born a slave and achieved prominence as a botanist, to attend a white university and do so 90 years earlier than for me to program a supercomputer in that same white university. In 1987, and after it was discovered that I'm black and African, my access to vector supercomputers were revoked. In 1987, I filed a formal complaint that I wasn't allowed to program the vector supercomputer that was inside the San Diego Supercomputer Center. That center was operated by the University of California, San Diego, California. That supercomputer was bought for public use and paid for by the US National Science Foundation. In scientific research, to discover is to see something that was previously unseen. But paradoxically, the scientific reviewing process ensures that the reviewer remains forever unseen. Modern science is not race neutral. As a black mathematician who came of age in the 1980s, a white supercomputer scientist that was tasked to review my contributions to computer science will notice my race more than my discovery of the world's fastest computing. Race was the reason my discovery was rejected a dozen times in a dozen years and rejected by a dozen white reviewers. My discovery of the world's fastest computing across the slowest processors in the world was accepted in 1989 because I concealed that I was black and African born. The earlier reviewers were anonymous but knew that I was black and African. It seemed like the reviewers were ashamed to sign their names or even to publish their reviews. Their reviews were like writing a letter to the opinion page of a newspaper and then insisting that the letter be published anonymously. But only my words were reviewed, not my new and abstract equations and complex codes that were over the heads of the reviewers. Who has the financial resources needed to replicate and reconfirm the world's fastest computer that costs the budget of a small nation, or that might cost the $1,250 million that is the price tag of this year's fastest computer? The world's fastest computer of today costs more than the mile-long Second Niger Bridge in Nigeria. For that reason, the world's fastest computer cannot exist within the campus of the University of Nigeria or any university in the world. In 1989, I won what was referred to as the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing. Not only that, I was the only person to win the award alone. I was in the news and it created a cognitive dissonance in the minds of white supremacists. Because I was a black African in a majority white field, I was attacked by those who could not scribble the Philip Emeagwali equations as defined in my 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos. My discovery of the world's fastest speed in computing changed the way we look at the supercomputer of today. The fastest speed was a quantifiable metric and an indisputable fact. That contribution made me the subject of school essays on inventors and their inventions, particularly for schools in the USA, Canada, and Europe. On the downside, once I became famous and became the most visible supercomputer scientist, I drew well-orchestrated attacks. Professional jealousies fueled those vitriolic attacks. Those attacks were anonymously sponsored by scientists who perceived my contributions to science as a zero-sum game that will affect their rankings negatively. In a viral poll, Philip Emeagwali was on par with Albert Einstein, Pythagoras, and Euclid. It's a centuries-old tradition to attack the greatest scientists as frauds. It's science's version of calling the President of the United States and the Pope the Antichrist. Hitler and Napoleon were called the Antichrist. William Shakespeare, Isaac Newton, and Albert Einstein were called frauds. I'm now cross-listed in Genius List with Albert Einstein in Genius Lists. As my reputation grows, I became the new antichrist from the scientific world. Each generation recreates its witches of Salem trial of colonial Massachusetts, where more than 200 quote-unquote witches were outed, and some witches were executed by hanging. The modern recreations of the witches of Salem trial include the Holocaust and the two atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. It includes the McCarthyism, guilt by association of being a communist, as well as the Wounded Knee Massacre, in which US soldiers murdered nearly 300 Lakota people, and the September 11 attacks. Every celebrity is hated by about 1% of her followers. The reason is that some people are jealous or threatened by others' success. The new pope is always criticized as the new Antichrist. William Shakespeare is always criticized as a plagiarist. The most famous theoretical physicist, Albert Einstein, is criticized as a fraud. Many people still think the moon landings were faked. After my discovery of 1989, I became the most famous computational physicist and mathematician. As expected, the same template used to attack Albert Einstein was used to attack Philip Emeagwali. Those attacks were backhanded compliments only given to famous mathematicians who were admitted into the Genius Club. It's impossible to fake my way from the world's slowest processors to the world's fastest computer. My discovery of the world's fastest computing is the foundational knowledge of the $45 billion a year supercomputer industry. The computer and its inventors are not fake. In 1989, I won the highest award in supercomputing. I was the only person to ever win that award alone. That award is shared by up to 50 research mathematicians, physicists, and computer scientists that are supported by a 1,000 employee research and development laboratory. The condition for receiving any of the highest prizes in science is that the recipient must deliver a lecture and do so before an audience of up to 1,000 scientists. Since 1989, I've gone beyond that 60-minute lecture requirement. I've posted 1,000 podcasts and YouTube videos, each on my contributions to science. Aside from winning the Nobel Prize of Supercomputing, I used podcasts and YouTube videos to establish my credibility and reputation among college-educated listeners who are interested in learning about new sciences. Thanks to the internet, the 12-year-old writing an essay on computer pioneers who contributed to the development of the computer get to hear directly from Philip Emeagwali. My contributions to science were these. I discovered how to visualize global warming and climate modeling, not merely as one incredibly compute-intensive problem, but as 65,536 equal-sized mathematical physics problems that are defined across the entire 62-mile deep concentric sphere that represents the atmosphere that enshrouds the Earth. Between the internet and the Earth, I was the elephant in the room. Newspapers profiled Philip Emeagwali for discovering the world's fastest computation across a new internet that's a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. But nobody wanted to talk about how I discovered the fastest computing across a new global network of the slowest processors and invented the technology across that new internet. A famous scientist is always envied and subjected to criticisms. Before my discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors, which occurred on the 4th of July 1989, no scientist said a nasty word about Philip Emeagwali and vice versa. However, some nasty words began to spread after I became famous. Those nasty words were spread because I denied unqualified scientists, then in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the opportunity to become my co-inventor and become a famous inventor. In 1981, I invited those research scientists to collaborate in my supercomputer research. Those white science supremacists declined to work with me because I was Black and African, and because they believed that fastest computing across slowest processors will forever remain in the realm of science fiction. The fastest computers are quote-unquote state secrets. They're used for top-secret simulations of nuclear explosions. For security reasons, I was banned from supercomputing within US nuclear labs. I was denied entry inside nuclear labs because I was a Black African and was perceived as a greater security threat than a white European. Those bans on my having access to the world's most powerful supercomputers occurred in the early 1980s. Looking back retrospectively, each rejection that I encountered in my quest for the fastest computations moved me closer to my discovery of the fastest computing across the slowest processors. My discovery occurred on the 4th of July 1989 in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. I've been supercomputing since June 20, 1974 in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. It took me half a century to gain the scientific knowledge and contribute the new technology which I presented across my 1,000 closed caption videos that are posted in YouTube. Hence, it will also take you 5 decades to fully understand my contribution to the computer and the internet. The US government classified it as a grand challenge problem because it's incredibly difficult to understand and solve. To this day, no other mathematician has stepped forward to claim he understands how to parallel process the initial boundary value problem that was governed by my new partial differential equations and then solve them across an ensemble of 10 million processors. And along the way, reproduce my world's fastest computation as mentioned in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. My name, Philip Emeagwali, was in the science column of a mid-1972 issue of the Daily Times that was the national newspaper of Nigeria. My name and photo were on the cover of a weekly newspaper that circulated in the cities of Monmouth and Independence, Oregon. That newspaper featured me in an interview that it published during the week of August 12, 1974 in the Polk County of Oregon. I conducted my supercomputing alone, and I did so for all the years that followed 1974. And by 1989, I was the foremost, or rather the only, person that could harness millions of processors under the hood of the world's fastest computer and use them to solve some of the most significant problems at the frontiers of mathematics and science. On the morning of Thursday, June 20, 1974, I woke up in my new studio apartment that was one of the 4 rooms that was upstairs of an old White House at 195A South Milk Street, Beaumont, Oregon, USA. I was living alone at age 19 and on an F1 student visa. My rent was $36 a month, and my salary was $1.65 an hour, which was the minimum wage. After taxes and expenses, my take-home pay was only $1 an hour. As international students, we could only work up to 16 hours a week and only work within our school campuses. My landlady was an elderly white woman who lived downstairs. After living at 36 Butler Hall for 10 weeks, 195A South Milk Street became my second address in the USA. At 195A, we had a community kitchen, which I shared with 3 tenants, a 24-year-old Ethiopian student in his 3rd year in the USA, a 25-year-old American graduate student who looked like the actor Tom Selleck, and a 20-year-old American student, Fritz Folk, and his future wife, Barbara. Amos, a Yoruba Nigerian graduate student in his 30s, lived downstairs. The teletypewriter laboratory, from which I logged into the supercomputer, was a short stroll away. That computer lab was at 345 Monmouth Avenue North, Monmouth, Oregon. The supercomputer that I programmed and used to solve a system of equations of algebra was at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon. I remotely logged into that supercomputer by telephone. On June 20, 1974, it was an epiphany to presume that I could have spent the previous 10 years programming a supercomputer that was in Corvallis, Oregon, USA. But programming that supercomputer from my father's houses that were along Benoba Road, Abo, Nigeria, and at 4B Ebunadazia Street, Onitsha, Nigeria, which was a distance of 12,500 kilometers or nearly 8,000 miles. All that I needed to program a supercomputer in post-colonial Nigeria of 1964 was only a $100 teletypewriter and a telephone line. I could program that supercomputer from anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa and program it in a decade. There was no computer in sub-Saharan Africa. As a supercomputer scientist who came of age in the 1970s and 80s, my focus was on pushing the boundaries of knowledge of the world's fastest computers. I pushed the frontiers of mathematics and physics when I made the news headlines for inventing how to solve the world's most compute-intensive problems in science, engineering, and medicine. To invent is to create something from nothing, or to make the fictional factual. In the 1970s and 80s, and as a young black African-born person, supercomputing in the USA, I experienced lots of racial obstacles that almost wore me down. By the late 1980s, I grew significantly and developed a reputation for giving public lectures in which I exhibited a command of mathematical and scientific materials. That should be expected after my decade and a half of deep introspection. After 15 years of supercomputing, following June 20, 1974, I developed greater clarity. I focused on the world's fastest computers. Because of my greater mathematical maturity, some computational physicists within my inner circle knew that I was heading towards the world's fastest computer. I discovered the world's fastest computing on July 4, 1989, in Los Alamos, New Mexico, USA. My discovery made the news around the world, and it remains the subject of school essays. In June 1974 and in Oregon, my scientific influences were science fiction stories, including the one about 64,000 human computers working together to forecast the weather around the world. That science fiction story was published on February 1, 1922, or 52 years earlier. My second influence was an article in the January 11, 1946 issue of the New York Times. That article was on how 100 computers could be programmed to work together to forecast the weather in the USA and forecast it more accurately. That 1922 supercomputing story was fictional, but I reimagined it as factual. That 1922 story was about 64,000 human computers used to, quote, raise the weather for the whole globe, unquote. In the 1980s, I reimagined and concretized that science fiction story, and I did so with 64 binary thousand processors. I programmed each processor to solve the weather forecasting compute-intensive problem. At its mathematical core, that problem was to solve a system of coupled nonlinear, three-dimensional, and time-dependent partial differential equations that governed and defined an initial boundary value problem beyond the frontier of calculus. The science fiction story that was in the January 11, 1946 issue of the New York Times was about 100 all-vacuum tube supercomputers around the US. What I parallel processed with was a new internet that was a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. My internet was defined by an email address space. That's a unique arrangement of one binary million zeros and ones. I built around the 1922 and 1946 stories that were vague science fiction theories. At its mathematical physics core, those grand challenge problems were about large-scale, high-resolution computational fluid dynamics. The poster child of fluid dynamics simulations is forecasting the weather or computing the motions of fluids across the Earth's atmosphere and up to 7.7 miles or 12.4 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. The 1922 story was fictional, while the 1946 story was theorized. I built around both stories to conceive my ensemble of 64 binary thousand processors, which replaced the equivalent of 100 computers of 1946 and replaced the 64,000 human computers of 1922. I did a back of the envelope calculation that showed me that if those 64,000 computers were evenly distributed within the Earth's stratosphere, there would be 3,000 square miles afar and apart from their nearest neighbors. I conceived fastest computing across slowest processors and across an internet that's a global network of those processors, and did so shortly after June 20, 1974. I conceived supercomputing across a hyperbolic global network of 64,000 computers around the globe. However, my scientific discovery that was mentioned 16 years later in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal was executed across a spherical island of 64 binary thousand processors. I visualized those processors as equal distances are far and apart and on the surface of a globe that I imagined as embedded inside a 16-dimensional hyperspace. In an email, a 12-year-old asked, "Why is Philip Emeagwali called the father of the internet?" I discovered that the world's fastest computer that's defined across a globe is a close cousin to the internet that's also defined across a globe. The supercomputer and internet that I invented are like identical twins and like two sides of the same coin that are different but complementary. The play, The Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, should not be performed the way William Shakespeare originally envisioned and directed it. William Shakespeare wrote for his 16th century audiences, or half a millennium ago. Hamlet should be reinterpreted anew and made relevant for 21st century audiences. William Shakespeare was a product of his times, who, if given the opportunity to rewrite Hamlet for the 21st century, would replace the kings and queens that lived 500 years ago with the worst dictators of modern times, such as Donald Trump, Idi Amin, and Adolf Hitler. The 21st century Hamlet should have heroes like Nelson Mandela using a cell phone and the internet, like William Shakespeare will do if he is still living. I updated my description and definition of the world's fastest computer from the one processor supercomputer of the 20th century to the billion processor supercomputer of the 21st century. My new supercomputer became a new internet that's a new global network of processors for solving the most compute-intensive problems. Just as you must understand soccer and have the physical fitness and maturity that's needed to play in the World Cup games, you must also be at the frontiers of knowledge of physics and computer science and have the mathematical maturity that will be needed to solve the most compute-intensive problems arising at the frontiers of knowledge of both computational physics and abstract mathematics. In the 1980s, I controlled and programmed the yet-to-be understood ensemble of the world's slowest processors that I later used to power my world's fastest computer speed that made the news headlines. During the 16 years that followed June 20, 1974, I added new layers of supercomputing knowledge. I did so by solving initial boundary value problems at the frontiers of calculus and extreme-scale computational fluid dynamics, and solving them via automated communication. I visualized my new internet as a new global network of 65,536 processors that were identical and that shared nothing and that were equal distances apart. I hypothesized those processors to be on the surface of a globe called a hypersphere in the 16-dimensional hyperspace. I invented how to solve the most compute-intensive mathematical physics problems called extreme-scale computational fluid dynamics, and solve them across a new internet that's a new global network of up to 1 billion self-contained processors which were identical and coupled. Each processor operated its operating system. Each processor had its dedicated memory that shared nothing. Extremely fast computers are used to make the coronavirus disease visible, as well as identify how tiny droplets move and spread in different circumstances, including real-world simulations of social distancing rules. In 1989, I was in the news because I discovered the world's fastest computing and did so across an ensemble of processors that today has the combined power of 20 million smartphones. Supercomputers are used to make discoveries at the fastest pace and used to pull the future closer. I'm Philip Emeagwali. Thank you very much.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.